Hey guys, tonight we delve into a role so grim, so essential, and yet so utterly reviled that it makes your worst job experiences look like a walk in a sun-drenched park. Imagine, for a moment, the rough cobblestones beneath your worn leather shoes, the air thick with the smells of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely agricultural. You hear the clamour of a medieval town square, a cacophony of merchants hawking their wares, children laughing, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. But then, a hush falls. A figure of authority, stern-faced and draped in the colours of the local lord, scans the crowd. Their eyes, cold and appraising, seem to settle on you. And trust me, in the world we're about to step into, a bad day at the office took on a whole new and rather final meaning for some. It's a journey into a life you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, or perhaps even your mildly annoying medieval neighbour who keeps letting his chickens into your herb garden. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps the channel find other curious minds like yours. And, as always, I'd love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The murmur of the marketplace around you, once a comforting background drone, now seems to sharpen, every sound grating on your nerves. You're just trying to buy a loaf of slightly stale bread, the best your few coins can afford, when the bailiff's gaze locks onto yours. It's not a friendly look, it's a look that says, I have a task, and you, my friend, are the unfortunate solution. You're young, perhaps in your late teens or early 20s, strong enough from years of manual labour, whether tilling stubborn fields or hauling goods for a dismissive master. You've never thought much about your future beyond hoping for a slightly less leaky roof, or maybe, just maybe, an extra piece of meat in your stew once a week. Ambition is a luxury you can't afford. Suddenly you're being beckoned. Not asked, beckoned. There's a subtle but unmistakable threat in the bailiff's crooked finger. Your heart hammers against your ribs like a trapped bird. What could this be about? Did you forget to bow low enough when Lord Beaumont passed by yesterday? Is it about that scuffle with the baker's boy over a dropped pie? No, this feels heavier. You're led, or rather nudged through the parting crowd, their curious, pitying stares burning into your back. You arrive before the bailiff, a man whose jowls quiver with self-importance. He clears his throat, a sound like gravel rolling downhill. It has come to our attention, he intones, loud enough for the nearest Gawkers to hear, that the position of public enforcer requires filling. He pauses, letting the euphemism hang in the fetid air. You're not daft. You know what public enforcer means. It means the town's executioner, old Master Griselda, finally succumbed to that hacking cough that had plagued him for years, a cough many whispered was a divine judgment in itself. Your mind races. Why you? This wasn't a job fair with sign-up sheets and promises of dental plans. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of being volunteered for a task nobody else wants, like cleaning the communal latrine after a particularly rowdy festival, but with significantly higher stakes and much, much worse smells. One common route into this charming profession was heredity. If your father or another close male relative had wielded the axe or tightened the noose, then congratulations, you were probably next in line. This is a well-documented historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, the executioner's trade was passed down from father to son, creating entire dynasties of state-sanctioned killers. Perhaps your own father, a man you barely remember, or an uncle you were told moved away, held this very post. The bailiff might even mention it, a casual damning remark. Your father served the town well in this capacity, as I recall. It's in your blood, boy. Or perhaps your path is darker. Maybe you were recently on the other side of the law, a condemned thief or poacher, and you've been offered a grim commutation. Serve the crown as its bringer of justice, or face that justice yourself. It's a choice between a life of ostracism and a swift, brutal end. Not much of a choice, really. Some executioners were recruited directly from the ranks of criminals, their sentences exchanged for service. It was a practical, if morally murky, solution for the authorities. Then there's the possibility you just fit a certain profile. Strong arms, a steady hand, perhaps a certain impassivity that they mistake for resilience. They don't want someone too bright, someone who will ask too many questions or be overly troubled by conscience. Historians still argue whether individuals actively sought out the executioner's role for its perceived, albeit grim, security, or if it was almost universally a position filled through coercion and dire necessity. Given the universal shunning that came with the job, it's hard to imagine queues forming. You stand there, mute, the world tilting slightly. Your career aptitude test basically involved not fainting at the thought of what's to come, a far cry from today's personality quizzes. There's a peculiar fringe tidbit some old folks whisper about, that sometimes, in desperate need, the authorities would look for someone born with a caul, a piece of amniotic membrane over the head. While usually seen as a sign of good luck or protection from drowning, in some darker folklore, it was twisted into a mark of one destined for a life outside the normal bounds of society. Someone who could mediate between life and death. Perhaps someone noticed such a thing at your birth, a detail long forgotten until now, dredged up to justify your selection. The bailiff isn't asking for volunteers, he's informing you of your new reality. The town requires this service, he says, his voice flat. You will be provided with the necessary implements and a small stipend. Refusal is inadvisable. The unspoken threat hangs heavy. Refusal means prison, or worse. It means being branded a troublemaker, an enemy of order. In this rigid, hierarchical society, you don't say no to the Lord's bailiff. Your family, if you have one nearby, will be horrified. Your mother might weep. Your siblings might look away, already feeling the chill of your new status. Friends. They'll likely evaporate like morning mist. So much for that quiet life-carving wooden spoons you were dreaming of. Turns out the universe had publicly sanctioned sharp object wielder on your cosmic bingo card. The weight of it settles on your shoulders, heavier than any sack of grain you've ever carried. You're no longer just Thomas or Will or whatever your name was. You're about to become the Executioner, a title that will cling to you like the scent of fear and stale blood. You swallow, a dry, painful click in your throat, and turn away from the bailiff. The crowd, which had been oppressive bodies just moments before, seems to melt away from you, creating an invisible, uncomfortable circle of space. It's like you've suddenly developed an extremely potent, though entirely imaginary, body odour. Whispers follow you, not loud, but sharp enough to prickle your skin. That's him, they hiss, the new one. Eyes that might have offered a friendly nod yesterday now slide away, finding sudden fascination with a loose cobblestone or a particularly dull patch of sky. The journey back to your meagre lodgings, whether it's a small room you rent or a corner in a shared hovel, feels 10 times longer than it did this morning. Each step is heavy, not just with the news, but with the dawning, crushing weight of what it truly means. If you have family, the scene that awaits you is one of quiet despair. Your mother, her face already etched with the hardships of medieval life, might cover her mouth to stifle a sob, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and pity. Your father, if he's still around, might just stare into the fire, his silence a heavier condemnation than any shouted words. Siblings who once squabbled and played with you, now look at you with a new, uncomfortable distance. You are in an instant a source of shame, a blight upon the family name, however humble that name might be. They'll worry, and rightly so, that your new profession will taint them too. Will their own friends shun them? Will they be whispered about at the market, their goods suddenly less appealing, their company less welcome? Your social calendar, by the way, has just opened up considerably for, quiet contemplation and existential dread. This isn't just about people being a bit squeamish. Your new role places you squarely in the category of what were known as dishonourable trades, or in German-speaking lands, unehrliche Leute. This is a solid historical fact. Executioners, along with knackers, who disposed of animal carcasses, grave diggers, latrine cleaners, and sometimes even bathhouse attendants and minstrels, were considered to live outside the normal bounds of respectable society. They performed necessary, often legally mandated tasks, but were tainted by the very nature of their work, dealing with death, waste, or what was considered morally dubious entertainment. You're not just the guy who carries out sentences, you're a symbol of death, pollution, and the grim necessities of justice. You quickly learn the new rules of engagement, or rather non-engagement. The baker you used to share a joke with now serves you with downcast eyes, pushing your loaf across the counter with a wooden paddle, careful that your hands don't touch. He might even charge you a little extra, a sort of hazard pay for dealing with the likes of you. At the alehouse, if you dare to enter, a space clears around you as if by magic. The tankard is slid towards you, and you're expected to pay by leaving coins on the counter, not directly into the alewife's hand. Forget sharing a bench or a friendly chat. You are, to put it mildly, socially radioactive. There's a peculiar, almost ritualistic element to this shunning. Historians still argue whether the intensity of this ostracism was uniform across all medieval societies, or if there were significant regional variations and periods where the executioner, while still feared, might have been treated with a modicum of pragmatic acceptance. Some evidence suggests that in certain towns, particularly smaller ones where everyone knew everyone, the lines might have been a little blurrier, but the general rule was profound exclusion. You might find yourself living in a designated area, often outside the main town walls or near the gallows itself. Prime real estate, if your prime concern is a distinct lack of noisy neighbours. This physical separation reinforces the social and psychological isolation. The church, the very heart of medieval community and spiritual life, becomes a place of anxiety. You might be allowed to attend services, but you'll be relegated to a specific undesirable spot, perhaps near the back by the door, the sinner's bench. Some priests might even be reluctant to offer you communion, fearing spiritual contamination. It's a bit like being picked last for celestial dodgeball every single time. Children, who once might have run past you without a second glance, now either stare with wide, frightened eyes or are quickly pulled away by their parents, often with a whispered warning. Their innocent reactions are perhaps the most painful, a constant reminder of your altered status. You become the local buggy man, a figure used to scare naughty children into obedience. Behave, or the headsman will get you. It's not exactly the legacy you dreamed of, and here's a quirky tidbit for you. In some regions, it was believed that anything an executioner touched regularly, or even things grown in his garden, were somehow tainted or unlucky. People might avoid buying vegetables if they knew they came from your patch of land, even if you were the only one with decent cabbages that year. This belief in your contaminating presence extended to all aspects of life. If a horse threw a shoe near your dwelling, some blacksmiths might be hesitant to reshoe it, or would perform some minor ritual of purification afterwards. It's a level of social distancing that makes modern-day anxieties seem almost quaint. The loneliness is a heavy cloak. You eat alone, you walk alone, your thoughts your only constant companions. The skills you might have had before, a knack for carpentry, a way with animals, a decent singing voice, are now overshadowed by the grim silhouette of the axe or the noose. Your identity is stripped down to this one terrifying function. You are the hand of the law, but a hand no one wants to shake or even brush against accidentally in a crowded street. The irony is bitter. You uphold the community's order, but you are by definition cast out from it. The very people you serve are the ones who ensure your solitude. Sleep offers little respite, as your days are filled with averted glances and hushed tones, and you begin to understand that this isn't just a job. It's a fundamental alteration of your place in the world. You are essential, and you are despised. And that, you realise with a sinking heart, is a contradiction you'll have to live with day in, day out. The bailiff, true to his word, though not exactly generous, arranges for you to receive your tools. It's not like popping down to the local hardware emporium for a new shovel. This is a far more solemn and, frankly, unnerving handover. You might be taken to a locked shed near the town jail, or perhaps even a designated room within the courthouse, a place that smells of dust, old iron, and something else you can't quite name but which makes the hairs on your arm stand up. The man responsible for them, perhaps a retiring assistant or a grim-faced jailer, will present them with little ceremony, his expression a mixture of distaste and professional detachment. First, and most iconic, there's the axe. Not just any wood-chopping axe, mind you. This is a specialised instrument, likely heavier, with a broader, crescent-shaped blade, designed for a specific brutal purpose. The steel might be well maintained, perhaps even with a faint sheen if the previous executioner took some pride in his equipment, or could be stained and nicked, a testament to its grim history. You'll feel the weight of it in your hands, a cold, alien heaviness. This is a tool for severing, for ending, and its very presence seems to suck the warmth from the room. It's sobering to think that historically, beheading axes were often custom-made and could vary significantly in design from region to region. Some were surprisingly ornate, others brutally functional. The famous German executioner Franz Schmidt, who kept a detailed diary in the 16th century, a bit later than pure medieval, but the tools didn't change that fast, listed several swords and axes amongst his professional equipment. Then there's the sword. In some principalities, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, execution by sword was considered a more honourable death, often reserved for nobles, while the axe was for commoners. An executioner's sword was typically a long, two-handed affair, often without a pointed tip, as it was designed for cutting, not thrusting. It required immense skill to wield effectively, to deliver a clean cut with a single blow. You might be shown one of these, its polished surface reflecting your own uneasy face. Think of it as the aristocratic option on the medieval "how do you want to go?" menu. Still not great, but with a touch more class, apparently. Next, the ropes. Coils of thick, rough hemp, perhaps treated with tallow or wax to make them run more smoothly, or more tightly. These are for hanging, of course, but also for binding prisoners. You'll learn about different knots, each with a specific application, from the simple restraints for transport to the complex, carefully constructed hangman's noose, designed to dispatch as efficiently as possible, though efficiently was a tragically variable term back then. The smell of the rope, earthy and slightly oily, will become another scent indelibly linked to your new life. And the collection doesn't stop there. You'll likely inherit a variety of branding irons, each with a different letter or symbol. T for thief, M for malefactor, F for forger. These would be heated in a brazier until glowing red, then pressed into the flesh of a convicted criminal, a permanent mark of their crime and shame. The sizzle and stench associated with their use are things you try not to imagine too vividly, but you know it's part of the job description. There might be scourges, whips and rods for floggings. Perhaps a wheel, the horrific instrument of breaking, where limbs were systematically shattered. Some executioners were also responsible for mutilations, the removal of hands, ears or tongues, depending on the crime and the local laws. For these, you'd have an assortment of knives and cleavers, probably kept separate from your kitchen utensils, one would hope. The sheer variety of implements speaks to the medieval imagination for punishment, a grim creativity you're now an unwilling participant in. Historians still argue whether the meticulous, almost ritualistic nature of these punishments served more as a genuine deterrent or as a form of brutal societal catharsis, a way for the community to collectively express its outrage and fear. You'll also likely find less obvious items, perhaps a sturdy leather apron, stained and stiff, offering minimal protection but a clear symbol of your trade. Heavy gloves, not for warmth, but to improve your grip or perhaps offer a sliver of psychological distance from your work. Maybe even a mask or hood. While the image of the hooded executioner is popular, it wasn't universally adopted. In some places, the executioner was expected to show his face, to be known, further cementing his role as a public official, albeit a feared one. The hood, when used, might have been as much for the condemned's peace of mind, not having to look their executioner in the eye, as for the executioner's anonymity or perceived menace. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some executioners were believed to have the ability to set broken bones or treat certain ailments, knowledge perhaps gleaned from the unfortunate side effects of their primary duties or from an understanding of anatomy that few others possessed. So, alongside your tools of punishment, you might inherit a small collection of well-worn bandages, splints, or even jars of dubious-looking salves. It's a strange paradox. The one who breaks bodies might also be the one sought, in hushed tones and under cover of darkness, to mend them. This wasn't a formal medical role, mind you, more like a folk practice born of grim experience. And it certainly wouldn't earn you a spot in the local physicians' guild. They'd probably shun you even harder. You run a finger gingerly over the cold steel of an axe blade. It's sharper than you expected. These aren't just objects, they're extensions of the law's harshest pronouncements, and now they're extensions of you. The responsibility feels immense, suffocating. There's no instruction manual, no HELT, and safety briefing. You learn by doing, or perhaps by watching an older, more experienced hand if you're lucky enough to be an apprentice first. But for you, thrust into the role, it's a case of sink or, well, probably still sink, just in a different way. You pack them away, or are directed where to store them. The clang of metal on metal echoing in the quiet room, a sound that will soon become far too familiar. The tools are yours now, a grim inheritance, and with them, all the fear, disgust, and dark fascination they represent. The day arrives for your first public performance. You've known it was coming, of course. Justice, in medieval times, wasn't a private affair conducted behind closed doors. It was a spectacle, a piece of grim theatre designed to instruct and terrify the populace into obedience. And you, my friend, are the reluctant star. The condemned, a notorious highwayman perhaps, or a woman accused of witchcraft, has been paraded through the streets, subjected to the jeers and missiles of the crowd. Now the procession is nearing the scaffold, a rough wooden platform erected in the main square or just outside the town gates, deliberately visible. Your stomach churns with a nauseous cocktail of dread and adrenaline. You walk, usually at the rear of this grim parade, a space clearing around you, as if you carry a contagion, which, in a social sense, you do. You might be wearing a specific colour, often red or black, or a particular garment that marks your office. Your tools, perhaps the axe or sword gleaming dully, might be carried by an assistant if you have one, or by you yourself, adding to the theatricality. The crowd is a living entity, a many-headed beast, buzzing with a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a strange, almost festive excitement. This is, after all, a major event, a break from the monotony of daily toil. Remember those rare public holidays where everyone gathers for a parade? This is the medieval equivalent, just with a significantly less joyful endpoint. As you approach the scaffold, the noise intensifies. There are shouts, prayers, curses, and the sobbing of the condemned's kin, if any dare to show their faces. Hawkers might even be selling rotten fruit for throwing, or, conversely, small religious tokens. It's a marketplace of human emotion, raw and unfiltered. You climb the few steps onto the platform, the wood creaking ominously under your weight. From here, you have a clear view of the expectant faces, a sea of them stretching out before you. They're not looking at the priest who might be offering last rites, nor at the trembling magistrate reading the sentence. They're looking at you. The pressure is immense. This isn't just about ending a life, it's about doing it correctly, according to custom, and more importantly, according to the crowd's expectations. A clean, swift execution was seen as a sign of competence, a mark of a good executioner. A botched job, on the other hand, could enrage the crowd, who might see it as unnecessary cruelty or, worse, incompetence deserving of their immediate violent disapproval. There are historical accounts of crowds turning on clumsy executioners. It's a high-stakes performance where your worst critic isn't a theatre reviewer, but several hundred very angry, potentially violent citizens. The condemned is brought forward. Their eyes might be wide with terror, glazed with despair, or burning with defiance. You try to avoid their gaze, focusing on a point just beyond them, on the knot in the wood of the scaffold floor, on anything but the humanity of the person whose life you are about to take. You might be expected to say a few words, perhaps asking the condemned for forgiveness, a strange ritualistic tradition, given the circumstances. It was believed that if the condemned forgave their executioner, it lessened the spiritual burden on the executioner's soul. A historical fact, this ritual of asking for forgiveness was quite common in many parts of Europe. Whether it offered any genuine comfort to either party is of course debatable. You take up your position, your heart pounding like a drum against your ribs. If it's a beheading, the condemned is forced to kneel, their head placed on the block. You can feel the collective intake of breath from the crowd, a sudden sharp silence falling after the preceding din. All eyes are on your raised axe or sword. This is the moment of truth, the culmination of the entire grim ceremony. You have to be strong, steady, and precise. There's no room for hesitation, no second chances for a perfect first impression. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of public execution was truly deterrence, or if it fulfilled a more complex societal need for retribution and the symbolic reaffirmation of power. While the authorities certainly hoped it would scare potential wrongdoers straight, the almost festival-like atmosphere that sometimes accompanied these events suggests other darker psychological currents at play. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the absolute power of the ruling class. And here's a quirky, unsettling tidbit. Sometimes, after an execution, particularly of a notorious criminal. People in the crowd would rush forward to dip cloths in the blood of the condemned, or to try and obtain a splinter from the scaffold or a piece of the rope. These macabre souvenirs were believed to possess magical properties, to cure illnesses or bring good luck. So not only are you the main attraction, but your props are also highly sought-after collector's items. The executioner himself might even sell these grim relics as a sideline, another strange aspect of this profession. It's a bit like the band selling t-shirts after a concert, only infinitely more morbid. You take a breath, trying to steady your nerves. The silence is absolute, save for the whimpering of the condemned or the murmur of a prayer. This isn't a job for the faint of heart, nor for the clumsy. Your reputation, your safety, and perhaps even your soul depend on what happens in the next few seconds. The weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes, the anticipation, the sheer awful finality of it all presses down on you. This is your stage, your grim theatre, and the play is about to reach its bloody climax. You are the instrument of justice, the focal point of public fear and fascination, and the line between revered enforcer and reviled butcher is terrifyingly thin. The silence stretches, taut and brittle, then snaps. You swing. In an ideal world, a world you fleetingly, desperately wish for, the blow is clean. The head separates from the body in a single, swift arc. There's a collective gasp from the crowd, perhaps even a low murmur of approval for your grim efficiency. The justice is done. But this, as you're about to discover, is not always an ideal world, especially when you're new to the trade, nervous, or perhaps the condemned flinches at the last possible second. Imagine instead the sickening thud of the axe as it fails to cut cleanly through. Perhaps it strikes bone, glancing off, or doesn't go deep enough. A cry of agony erupts from the condemned, a sound that will haunt your nightmares for weeks. The crowd, moments before held in rapt attention, now lets out a collective groan or a roar of outrage. Their bloodlust, or their desire for a good death, has been thwarted. Now their focus shifts, and their anger is directed squarely at you. This is the executioner's ultimate professional nightmare. A botched execution was not just a personal failure, it was a public scandal, an affront to the assembled populace, and, in their eyes, perhaps even to God. You have to strike again, and possibly again, each blow more desperate, more gruesome than the last. The scene on the scaffold, already horrific, descends into a bloody, chaotic butchery. The condemned, still alive, writhes in unimaginable pain. The crowd's mood turns ugly, their jeers and curses raining down on you. You might hear shouts of clumsy fool, or butcher, or worse. Remember that uneasy feeling you had when you first picked up the axe? Multiply it by 1,000. There are numerous historical accounts of such horrific events. One of the most infamous examples, though slightly later than our core medieval period, is the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. It reportedly took 3 blows from the axe to sever her head, a gruesome affair that shocked even the hardened onlookers. The executioner of the rebellious Duke of Monmouth in 1685, Jack Ketch, whose name became a byword for a cruel or inept hangman, also made a terrible mess of it, requiring multiple agonizing strikes and reportedly even resorting to a knife to finish the job after the crowd's fury erupted. While these are from a later period, the principle and the crowd reaction remained consistent with medieval precedents. The expectation was for a swift, decisive end. The consequences for you, the executioner, could be severe. In some instances, an enraged crowd might storm the scaffold, intent on exacting their own form of justice on the incompetent headsman. Your life could very well be in danger. Your assistants, if you have any, might try to protect you, or they might melt away into the chaos, leaving you to face the mob alone. It's a stark reminder that your authority is entirely dependent on your ability to perform your dreadful duty with a chilling proficiency. There's no union to protect you, no grievance procedure. Your job review is immediate, public, and potentially fatal. It's probably the only job where doing it badly could literally get you killed by your customers. Even if you escape physical harm, your reputation is in tatters. You'll be known as the bungler, the one who caused undue suffering. This could affect your pay, your already precarious social standing, and your own psychological well-being. The guilt and shame of such an event would be a heavy burden to carry, Each future execution would be shadowed by this failure, the crowd's eyes even more critical, their patience even thinner. Historians still argue whether the skill of an executioner was something that could be reliably taught, or if it was more a matter of innate nerve and physical aptitude. Were there schools for executioners, or was it purely on-the-job training, with all the horrifying potential for error that implies? While formal schools are unlikely in the medieval period, apprenticeships were common, where a novice would learn by observing and assisting a more experienced master. But even then, the step up to performing a beheading solo was a monumental one. And here's a quirky, rather grim tidbit. If the execution was particularly messy, it could fuel all sorts of dark superstitions. Some might believe that the condemned was supernaturally protected, or that the executioner himself was cursed or possessed by a demon, causing his hand to falter. Such beliefs could make your already isolated life even more difficult, with people actively avoiding you not just out of social convention but out of genuine fear of supernatural malevolence. Imagine trying to buy that loaf of bread when people think you might have a tiny, invisible demon on your shoulder whispering bad axe-swinging advice. The physical act itself is demanding. An executioner's axe or sword is heavy. To swing it with enough force and precision to decapitate a human being in one blow, especially a struggling or terrified one, requires considerable strength, a steady hand, and nerves of steel. You're not just chopping wood, you're navigating bone, sinew, and the horrifying unpredictability of a living body. The block might be too low or too high. The condemned might faint or resist. Any number of things can go wrong. The smell of blood, thick and metallic, fills your nostrils. The sight before you is one of carnage. You might feel bile rise in your throat, but you have to maintain composure, or at least the appearance of it. You have to finish the job, however badly it has begun. The magistrate is watching, the guards are watching, and the entire town is watching. This is your profession, your curse, and your inescapable reality. The weight of that failed swing, the echo of that cry, the roar of the crowd, these will stay with you, a constant chilling reminder of the razor's edge upon which your terrible career is balanced. The desire for a strong drink afterwards would be overwhelming, assuming any alehouse would actually serve you without making you stand outside in the rain. So you've navigated the terror of a public execution, hopefully a clean one. The crowd disperses, still buzzing with the grim spectacle, leaving you on the blood-stained scaffold, the scent of iron heavy in the air. Now what? You can't exactly clock out and head home for a quiet evening. There's the grim clean-up, but beyond that there's the small matter of getting paid. You'd think a job this specialised, this unpleasant, and this essential would come with a hefty salary, perhaps hazard pay, and a decent benefits package. You would, unfortunately, be mostly wrong. The ways executioners were remunerated in the medieval period were varied, often inconsistent and frequently odd. There wasn't usually a fixed annual salary in the modern sense, especially for executioners in smaller towns or less prominent jurisdictions. Your income might be a patchwork of fees, perquisites, and frankly, some rather unsavoury sidelines. Think of it as the gig economy, but with significantly more public shaming and fewer 5-star reviews. Firstly, you'd likely receive a fee for each specific act performed, a certain amount for a hanging, another for a beheading, which being more skilled, sometimes paid better, a smaller sum for a flogging or a branding. These fees were often stipulated by the local authorities, the town council or the lord of the manor. A historical fact, these fee schedules can sometimes be found in old town records, meticulously listing the price for each type of punishment. For instance, the records of some German towns show that an executioner might receive a few guilders for a beheading, but considerably less for a lesser punishment like whipping. However, these fees weren't always generous. Sometimes they were shockingly low, barely enough to live on, especially if there was a quiet period with few condemnations. You weren't exactly hoping for a crime wave to make ends meet, but a long spell of civic peace could be financially challenging. This led to the necessity of supplementary income. One common and rather grim perquisite was the right to the condemned person's clothing and sometimes even their personal effects, assuming they weren't claimed by the victim's family or forfeited to the crown. So after the execution, you might find yourself rifling through the pockets of the deceased, looking for a few coins or any small item of value. It's a macabre form of payment, effectively looting the corpse you just created, and does little to endear you to anyone. Then there were the more entrepreneurial aspects of the job. Remember those body parts and bloody rags the crowd was eager for? You, as the executioner, were often the primary vendor of these gruesome relics. The rope used for a hanging, cut into small pieces, could be sold as good luck charms or cures for various ailments. Splinters from the scaffold, the blood of the executed, all could command a price from the superstitious populace. This trade in human remains, known as hangman's perquisites, was a recognised, if stomach-churning part of the executioner's income in many places. It's like running a very niche, very morbid Etsy shop. Beyond the scaffold, your skills could be in demand in other ways. As mentioned before, some executioners developed a sideline as quasi-medical practitioners. They might be paid to set bones, treat wounds, often those inflicted by judicial punishment, or even prepare medicines from rather dubious ingredients. This medical practice was, of course, on the absolute fringes of society and viewed with deep suspicion by actual physicians. Historians still argue whether this practice was born out of genuine, albeit crudely acquired anatomical knowledge, or if it was more akin to folk magic, trading on the executioner's fearsome reputation. Furthermore, some executioners were given other civic duties that fell into the unclean category. You might be responsible for collecting stray dogs, disposing of animal carcasses, acting as a knacker, or even cleaning the town latrines. These tasks, while unpleasant, provided additional albeit meagre income streams. You were essentially the town's go-to person for anything dirty, dangerous, or deadly. The job description was less executioner and more department of unpleasant necessities. Here's a quirky tidbit about payment. In some areas, the executioner was entitled to a certain portion of goods sold in the marketplace, a kind of informal tax. He might have the right to take a handful of grain from every sack, a piece of fruit from every basket, or even a small measure of wine from every cask. This was known as Handlun or Pfändung in some Germanic regions. Naturally, merchants weren't thrilled about this, and it often led to confrontations. Imagine the tension as you, the feared executioner, approach a stall, and the vendor has to watch you take your due while trying not to look too resentful. It's a recipe for awkward social interactions, to say the least. Housing was sometimes provided, that lovely little cottage by the gallows we talked about, which could be considered a form of payment in kind. However, its location usually meant its market value was, shall we say, depressed. Free rent is nice, but not if it comes with a permanent aura of death and despair. The inconsistency and often degrading nature of your payment methods underscored your outcast status. You weren't seen as a professional deserving of a fair wage for a difficult job. You were someone who profited from death and misfortune, scraping a living from the grim fringes of society. The money you earned was often seen as blood money, tainted by its source. People might be reluctant to accept coins directly from your hand, fearing they carried bad luck or spiritual contamination. So, while you performed a vital function for the state, ensuring its laws were enforced in the most final way, you rarely reaped significant financial rewards. Your compensation was a strange and often unsettling mix of official fees, morbid sales, and undesirable side hustles. It was enough to survive, perhaps, but rarely enough to thrive, and certainly not enough to buy your way into respectable society. The clink of coins in your purse would always be accompanied by the silent societal judgment of how they were earned. You might think that with a title like executioner, your job description would be pretty straightforward. Execute people. And while that was certainly the headline act, the main event that drew the crowds and defined your public image, your duties often extended into a whole host of other unpleasant and sometimes downright bizarre tasks. You were, in essence, the medieval state's multi-tool for everything unsavoury that didn't involve actual warfare. Your week could be surprisingly varied, though consistently grim. Beyond the scaffold and the noose, one of your most common ancillary duties was torture. Before a condemned prisoner was executed, or even sometimes to extract a confession from a suspect, guilty or not, torture was a legally sanctioned part of the judicial process in many medieval jurisdictions. And guess who got to apply the thumbscrews, the rack, or the strappado? That's right, lucky you. You'd be summoned to the dungeons, those damp, lightless places beneath the courthouse or castle, where the air was thick with fear and despair. There, under the watchful eyes of magistrates or church officials, you would be instructed to inflict carefully calibrated amounts of pain. The aim, ostensibly, was to get to the truth, though the reliability of confessions extracted under extreme duress is, shall we say, highly questionable. You'd learn the mechanics of these dreadful machines, how much pressure to apply, how long to sustain the agony. It was a chillingly precise science of suffering. This is a well-documented historical fact. Executioners were routinely tasked with carrying out judicial torture, following specific legal guidelines, however brutal. The Carolina Code of 1532 in the Holy Roman Empire, for example, laid out procedures for torture, and the executioner was the designated official to perform it. Then there were the lesser physical punishments, those that didn't necessarily kill but were designed to maim, mark, and humiliate. We've touched on branding, pressing red-hot iron into flesh to leave a permanent scar identifying the bearer as a criminal. But it didn't stop there. Depending on the crime, you might be required to chop off a hand for thieves, cut out a tongue for blasphemers or perjurers, slit noses or clip ears. These mutilations were public spectacles, just like executions, intended to serve as a visceral warning. Each act required a degree of anatomical understanding, or at least the appearance of it. You have to finish the job however badly it has begun. The magistrate is watching, the guards are watching, and the entire town is watching. This is your profession, your curse, and your inescapable reality. The weight of that failed swing, the echo of that cry, the roar of the crowd, these will stay with you, a constant chilling reminder of the razor's edge upon which your terrible career is balanced. The desire for a strong drink afterwards would be overwhelming, assuming any alehouse would actually serve you without making you stand outside in the rain. So, you've navigated the terror of a public execution, hopefully a clean one. The crowd disperses, still buzzing with the grim spectacle, leaving you on the blood-stained scaffold, the scent of iron heavy in the air. Now what? You can't exactly clock out and head home for a quiet evening. There's the grim clean-up, but beyond that, there's the small matter of getting paid. You'd think a job this specialised, this unpleasant and this essential would come with a hefty salary, perhaps hazard pay, and a decent benefits package. You would, unfortunately, be mostly wrong. The ways executioners were remunerated in the medieval period were varied, often inconsistent and frequently odd. There wasn't usually a fixed annual salary in the modern sense, especially for executioners in smaller towns or less prominent jurisdictions. Your income might be a patchwork of fees, perquisites, and frankly, some rather unsavoury sidelines. Think of it as the gig economy, but with significantly more public shaming and fewer 5-star reviews. Firstly, you'd likely receive a fee for each specific act performed, a certain amount for a hanging, another for a beheading, which being more skilled, sometimes paid better, a smaller sum for a flogging or a branding. These fees were often stipulated by the local authorities, the town council or the lord of the manor. A historical fact, these fee schedules can sometimes be found in Old Town records, meticulously listing the price for each type of punishment. For instance, the records of some German towns show that an executioner might receive a few guilders for a beheading, but considerably less for a lesser punishment like whipping. However, these fees weren't always generous. Sometimes they were shockingly low, barely enough to live on, especially if there was a quiet period with few condemnations. You weren't exactly hoping for a crime wave to make ends meet, but a long spell of civic peace could be financially challenging. This led to the necessity of supplementary income. One common and rather grim perquisite was the right to the condemned person's clothing, and sometimes even their personal effects, assuming they weren't claimed by the victim's family or forfeited to the crown. So, after the execution, you might find yourself rifling through the pockets of the deceased, looking for a few coins or any small item of value. It's a macabre form of payment, effectively looting the corpse you just created, and does little to endear you to anyone. Then there were the more entrepreneurial aspects of the job. Remember those body parts and bloody rags the crowd was eager for? You, as the executioner, were often the primary vendor of these gruesome relics. The rope used for a hanging, cut into small pieces, could be sold as good luck charms or cures for various ailments. Splinters from the scaffold, the blood of the executed, all could command a price from the superstitious populace. This trade in human remains, known as hangman's perquisites, was a recognised if stomach-churning part of the executioner's income in many places. It's like running a very niche, very morbid Etsy shop. Beyond the scaffold, your skills could be in demand in other ways. As mentioned before, some executioners developed a sideline as quasi-medical practitioners. They might be paid to set bones, treat wounds, often those inflicted by judicial punishment, or even prepare medicines from rather dubious ingredients. This medical practice was, of course, on the absolute fringes of society and viewed with deep suspicion by actual physicians. Historians still argue whether this practice was born out of genuine, albeit crudely acquired, anatomical knowledge, or if it was more akin to folk magic, trading on the executioner's fearsome reputation. Furthermore, some executioners were given other civic duties that fell into the unclean category. You might be responsible for collecting stray dogs, disposing of animal carcasses, acting as a knacker, or even cleaning the town latrines. These tasks, while unpleasant, provided additional, albeit meagre, income streams. You were essentially the town's go-to person for anything dirty, dangerous, or deadly. The job description was less executioner and more Department of Unpleasant Necessities. Here's a quirky tidbit about payment. In some areas, the executioner was entitled to a certain portion of goods sold in the marketplace, a kind of informal tax. He might have the right to take a handful of grain from every sack, a piece of fruit from every basket, or even a small measure of wine from every cask. This was known as Handlohn or Pfändung in some Germanic regions. Naturally, merchants weren't thrilled about this, and it often led to confrontations. Imagine the tension as you, the feared executioner, approach a stall, and the vendor has to watch you take your due while trying not to look too resentful. It's a recipe for awkward social interactions, to say the least. Housing was sometimes provided. That lovely little cottage by the gallows we talked about, which could be considered a form of payment in kind. However, its location usually meant its market value was, shall we say, depressed. Free rent is nice, but not if it comes with a permanent aura of death and despair. The inconsistency and often degrading nature of your payment methods underscored your outcast status. You weren't seen as a professional deserving of a fair wage for a difficult job. You were someone who profited from death and misfortune, scraping a living from the grim fringes of society. The money you earned was often seen as blood money, tainted by its source. People might be reluctant to accept coins directly from your hand, fearing they carried bad luck or spiritual contamination. So, while you performed a vital function for the state, ensuring its laws were enforced in the most final way, you rarely reaped significant financial rewards. Your compensation was a strange and often unsettling mix of official fees, morbid sales, and undesirable side hustles. It was enough to survive, perhaps, but rarely enough to thrive, and certainly not enough to buy your way into respectable society. The clink of coins in your purse would always be accompanied by the silent societal judgment of how they were earned. You might think that with a title like executioner, your job description would be pretty straightforward: execute people. And while that was certainly the headline act, the main event that drew the crowds and defined your public image, your duties often extended into a whole host of other unpleasant and sometimes downright bizarre tasks. You were, in essence, the medieval state's multi-tool for everything unsavoury that didn't involve actual warfare. Your week could be surprisingly varied, though consistently grim. Beyond the scaffold and the noose, one of your most common ancillary duties was torture. Before a condemned prisoner was executed, or even sometimes to extract a confession from a suspect, guilty or not, torture was a legally sanctioned part of the judicial process in many medieval jurisdictions. And guess who got to apply the thumbscrews, the rack, or the strappado? That's right, lucky you. You'd be summoned to the dungeons, those damp, lightless places beneath the courthouse or castle, where the air was thick with fear and despair. There, under the watchful eyes of magistrates or church officials, you would be instructed to inflict carefully calibrated amounts of pain. The aim ostensibly was to get to the truth, though the reliability of confessions extracted under extreme duress is, shall we say, highly questionable. You'd learn the mechanics of these dreadful machines, how much pressure to apply, how long to sustain the agony. It was a chillingly precise science of suffering. This is a well-documented historical fact. Executioners were routinely tasked with carrying out judicial torture, following specific legal guidelines, however brutal. The Carolina Code of 1532 in the Holy Roman Empire, for example, laid out procedures for torture, and the executioner was the designated official to perform it. Then there were the lesser physical punishments, those that didn't necessarily kill but were designed to maim, mark, and humiliate. We've touched on branding, pressing red-hot iron into flesh to leave a permanent scar identifying the bearer as a criminal. But it didn't stop there. Depending on the crime, you might be required to chop off a hand for thieves, cut out a tongue for blasphemers or perjurers, slit noses, or clip ears. These mutilations were public spectacles, just like executions, intended to serve as a visceral warning. Each act required a degree of anatomical understanding, or at least a brutal pragmatism, to carry out without accidentally killing the unfortunate recipient, unless, of course, that was the intended eventual outcome. Flogging or whipping was another common task. You'd tie the prisoner to a post in the market square and lay on the prescribed number of lashes with a scourge or birch rods. The crowd would gather to watch this too, another form of grim entertainment and moral instruction. You'd have to be strong enough to make the punishment severe, but also careful not to exceed the sentence. It was a physically demanding and deeply unpleasant job, splattering you with blood and no doubt the desperate pleas of the punished. Remember the pillory and the stocks? Those wooden contraptions where offenders were locked by their head, hands or feet, and exposed to public ridicule and abuse for hours, sometimes days. While you might not always be the one physically putting them in, you were often responsible for the upkeep of these devices and for escorting the prisoner to and from them. You might also be tasked with overseeing their period of punishment, ensuring they didn't escape or weren't too grievously harmed by an overzealous crowd, though a certain amount of rotten fruit and verbal abuse was generally considered part of the sentence. It's like being a very unpopular hall monitor for public humiliation. And what about those tasks that fell under the broad umbrella of public order, but were too distasteful for regular guards or officials? That's where you came in. As we mentioned, this could include disposing of the bodies of paupers or plague victims, clearing animal carcasses from the streets, or even managing populations of stray animals. Some executioners were also responsible for inspecting weights and measures in the market, or for ensuring public hygiene in certain areas, a rather ironic assignment, given your own unclean status. Historians still argue about the extent to which these ancillary duties were consistently assigned to executioners across different regions, or if they were more ad hoc responsibilities depending on local needs and the individual executioner's lack of bargaining power. Here's a quirky and rather specific tidbit. In some parts of Europe, particularly German-speaking lands, the executioner, known as the Scharfrichter, literally sharp judge, was also sometimes tasked with resolving disputes of honour among certain classes, not by judging but by overseeing duels or specific forms of ritual combat. It's a strange juxtaposition. The man who ends leaves by law might also be involved in managing potentially lethal encounters outside of it, though this was more common in the later medieval and early modern periods. Your toolkit, therefore, wasn't just axes and ropes. It would include manacles, chains, perhaps even specialised tools for extracting teeth, another form of punishment or torture in some cases, and the various implements of non-lethal corporal punishment. You were the medieval equivalent of a one-man SWAT team, but for enforcing sentences rather than arresting suspects, and with considerably worse public relations. So, your life wasn't just punctuated by the high drama of executions. It was a daily grind of less glamorous, but equally grim tasks. From the chilling silence of the torture chamber to the raucous humiliation of the pillory, your hands were involved in nearly every aspect of the state's coercive power. Each duty reinforced your isolation, marking you as the one who did society's dirty work, the tasks that others couldn't or wouldn't contemplate. It was a relentless immersion in the darkest aspects of human behaviour and societal control, ensuring that even on days without a beheading, your connection to suffering and punishment was never far away. The cumulative effect of your duties, the executions, the torture, the constant shunning, shapes every facet of your existence. You become a true fringe dweller, living on the absolute periphery of society both literally and figuratively. Your home, as we've noted, is likely set apart. If you're in a walled town, it might be just outside the gates, perhaps near the gallows field or the charnel house where unclaimed bodies are disposed of. This physical separation is a constant, visible reminder of your status. You see the town, its bustling life, its warm hearths, but you're not truly of a fit. It's like looking through a shop window at a feast you're forbidden to join. Your daily routines are marked by this separation. When you walk through the streets, perhaps to collect your meagre fees or to purchase necessities, that invisible circle of avoidance forms around you. People cross the road to avoid passing too close. Mothers pull their children near. Conversations cease abruptly as you approach. only to resume in hushed, wary tones once you've passed. You learn to read the subtle cues, the averted gaze, the slight tensing of shoulders, the way a shopkeeper might serve other customers before acknowledging your presence, even if you were there first. This isn't just rudeness, it's a deeply ingrained societal reflex. Your social interactions, if they can even be called that, are transactional and strained. You might develop a thick skin, a stoic demeanour, as a defence mechanism. Or perhaps the loneliness gnaws at you, a constant ache. The only people who might speak to you with any degree of normalcy are those who have no choice, the jailers, the magistrates giving you orders, and of course, the condemned themselves in their final moments. It's a pretty bleak guest list for your imaginary social gatherings. Consider the simple act of buying food. The baker, the butcher, the greengrocer, they all serve you with reluctance. Some might overcharge, as mentioned, a sort of defilement tax. Others might give you inferior goods, food that's slightly past its prime, knowing you have little recourse to complain. Where else would you go? You can't exactly threaten to take your business elsewhere when elsewhere is equally likely to treat you the same way. A historical fact, this economic discrimination was a common experience for those in dishonourable trades. Their limited social capital meant they had little power to contest unfair treatment in the marketplace. What about companionship? Finding a spouse would be incredibly difficult. Who would willingly marry into such a life, knowing they too would be shunned, their children marked by their father's profession? Often, executioners married the daughters of other executioners, or those from similarly ostracised professions, creating small, tight-knit but deeply isolated communities. It was a very small dating pool, likely with no medieval Tinder to help you swipe right on daughter of Naka, enjoys long walks by the gibbet. Friendships, as you knew them before this life, are almost certainly a thing of the past. Old acquaintances will avoid you. Making new friends among respectable folk is virtually impossible. You might find a grim camaraderie with others who live on the fringes, perhaps the local gravedigger or the rat-catcher, but even these connections would be tinged with the shared burden of societal disapproval. The church, a central pillar of medieval life, offers little solace. While you might be compelled to attend Mass, your presence is often unwelcome. You'd sit apart, perhaps in a designated executioner's pew, a physical manifestation of your spiritual quarantine. Confession could be a fraught experience. Some priests might be reluctant to hear the confession of a man whose profession involves such constant proximity to death and violence, fearing for their own spiritual purity. Historians still argue about the precise theological stance on executioners. Were they seen as sinners merely for performing their state-sanctioned duty, or was the sin mitigated by the just nature of the punishment they inflicted? The popular sentiment, however, was clearly one of deep unease and moral taint. Even your clothing could set you apart. Sometimes executioners were required to wear a specific garment or a badge of office that identified them, ensuring no one could mistake them for an ordinary citizen. This could be a particular colour, often red, symbolising blood, or sometimes green or striped patterns, which in medieval times could also signify marginal status. This visual marking made your isolation inescapable. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. In some folklore it was believed that an executioner could not drown, or that certain animals would behave strangely in his presence. Such beliefs, while not universally held, added another layer to the mystique and fear surrounding your person. People might cross themselves if you unexpectedly appeared, or mutter protective charms. It's like being a walking, talking omen, and rarely a good one. Your world shrinks. The vibrant tapestry of community life, the festivals, the weddings, the baptisms, the simple daily gossip and camaraderie, all happen at a distance, without your participation. You're a necessary evil, a functional component of the justice system, but you're never truly part of the society you serve. You inhabit a lonely island in the midst of a bustling sea of humanity. The tools of your trade become your most constant companions, the scaffold your most prominent stage. This profound and unyielding marginalisation is perhaps the heaviest burden of all, a psychological toll that accompanies every swing of the axe, every turn of the rack, every solitary walk home. The shadow of your profession doesn't just fall upon you, it stretches, long and chilling, towards any family you might have, particularly your children. If you do manage to find a wife, perhaps the daughter of another executioner from a neighbouring town, or a woman so desperate or outcast herself that your profession isn't a deterrent, The question of children brings a new layer of anxiety. Will they inherit your grim occupational stigma? The answer, sadly, is almost certainly yes. In many parts of medieval Europe, the executioner's trade was de facto hereditary. This wasn't always a formal legal requirement, but the intense social ostracism surrounding the role made it nearly impossible for an executioner's son to find any other respectable work. Who would apprentice the son of a headsman? What guild would accept him? What farmer would hire him as a labourer if other, less tainted hands were available? Society effectively funneled your male offspring towards the same grim path you trod. It's a bit like those old-fashioned businesses where it's Smith & Son, purveyors of fine wares, except in your case, it's Grimshaw & Son, purveyors of final farewells. Your sons, from a young age, would be acutely aware of their father's profession and the fear it instilled. They'd experience the same shunning in their own, smaller ways. Other children might be forbidden to play with them. They'd be pointed at in the village, whispered about. That's the headsman's boy. The sins of the father, or rather the societal stain of the father's necessary but reviled work, were visited upon the children with cruel certainty. A historical fact, dynasties of executioners, like the famous Sanson family in France, though they rose to prominence later, the principle of hereditary service existed much earlier in various regions, existed for generations, precisely because escaping the trade was so difficult. The children were, in a sense, born into a caste. For your daughters, the prospects were equally bleak, if different. Marriage options would be severely limited. Few respectable families would consider a match with an executioner's daughter, fearing the taint on their own lineage and social standing. Her dowry, even if you could scrape one together, might not be enough to overcome the stigma. Often, the only viable marriage partners for an executioner's daughter were other executioners, their sons or men from similarly marginalised professions like knackers or gravediggers. This intermarriage among outcast groups further solidified their separation from mainstream society. You'd watch your children grow up in this atmosphere of exclusion, knowing that your life's work had predetermined so much of their future. The joy of seeing them play, of teaching them skills, would always be tinged with the knowledge of the narrow shadowed path that lay before them. Could your son grow up to be a scholar, a merchant, a respected craftsman? Unlikely. He was far more likely to inherit your heavy apron and your grim toolkit. The psychological impact on your children could be profound. They might grow up resentful of you and your profession, or they might internalise the shame and fear, becoming withdrawn and isolated themselves. Alternatively, some might develop a defensive toughness, a defiant acceptance of their outcast status. Historians still argue whether children raised in these executioner families developed a unique subculture with its own values and coping mechanisms, or if they simply mirrored the broader societal rejection in their own internal lives. And here's a quirky, rather sad tidbit. There are anecdotal accounts and folkloric elements suggesting that even the games executioners' children played might have been macabre imitations of their father's work. Little boys playing executioner with wooden swords and dolls, a grim reflection of their predestined future. While hard to substantiate broadly, it speaks to the pervasive influence of the profession on every aspect of family life. It's a far cry from playing knights and dragons, more like playing judge and condemned. The decision to train your son in the family business would be a heavy one. You'd be teaching him the skills of an executioner, how to handle the sword or axe, how to tie a proper noose, perhaps even the gruesome techniques of torture and mutilation. Each lesson would be a confirmation of his limited future. You might try to instill in him a sense of duty, of professionalism, a detachment from the grim work, but you'd also know you were condemning him to the same life of isolation and public revulsion that you endure. There was, however, a strange flip side. Because the role was often hereditary and required specific, albeit grim, skills, an executioner's son who was properly trained might find a degree of job security, however unwelcome. Towns always needed someone to carry out punishments. If your son learned the trade well, he wouldn't starve, even if he was universally despised. It's a grim sort of career counselling. Son, the pay is terrible. Everyone will hate you, but it's steady work. The hope that your children might escape this life, might break free from the cycle of inherited shame, would be a faint one. Every averted gaze, every whispered comment directed at your child would be a painful reminder of the social cage your profession had built around your family. The curse, it seemed, was not just upon you, but upon your bloodline, a heavy, unwelcome legacy pay. said down through generations as tangible and inescapable as the executioner's axe itself. Living with the constant disapproval of your fellow humans is one thing. Worrying about the disapproval of the Almighty is quite another. In the deeply religious society of medieval Europe, where divine judgment was an ever-present concern and the state of one's soul was paramount, your profession placed you in a spiritually precarious position. You weren't just a social outcast. Many believed you were teetering on the brink of eternal damnation, and they looked for signs to prove it. The very nature of your work, deliberately taking human life, even under the sanction of law, was deeply problematic from a theological standpoint. While the Church generally upheld the right of secular authorities to impose capital punishment for grievous crimes, "He beareth not the sword in vain," as St. Paul wrote, was often cited. The individual who actually wielded that sword occupied a morally grey, and many thought, spiritually dark space. You were perpetually stained by blood, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally, and, in the popular imagination, spiritually too. Superstitions abounded. It was commonly believed that misfortune would follow an executioner, or that his presence could bring bad luck. If a crop failed near your dwelling, or if livestock fell sick, some might whisper that your unholy proximity was to blame. These weren't just idle tales. They could have real-world consequences, further deepening your isolation and making your life even more difficult. Imagine your well suddenly drying up. Is it a natural occurrence, or a sign of God's displeasure with your work? Your neighbours would likely opt for the latter. A significant historical fact is the difficulty executioners often faced in receiving religious rites. While generally not formally excommunicated, as they were after all performing a state-sanctioned duty, they could find themselves in a sort of spiritual limbo. We've touched on being relegated to a specific undesirable spot in church, but it could go further. Some priests might be hesitant to give you communion, to hear your confession, or, crucially, to provide last rites when your own time came. The fear was that close association with you, the dealer of death, could somehow contaminate them spiritually. This created a terrible paradox. The man whose work was so intimately tied to the ultimate fate of others faced profound uncertainty about his own soul's salvation. The tools of your trade were also seen as accursed. An axe or sword used for executions was often believed to be imbued with a dark power. People wouldn't want such an object in their homes, and it was thought that if it were used for ordinary purposes like chopping wood, it would bring misfortune. This is why your tools were kept separate, often under lock and key, objects of both fear and a kind of grim fascination. There was a prevailing belief that the souls of those you executed might linger, perhaps haunting you or the place of execution. The gallows field was almost universally considered a haunted place, a domain of restless spirits and demonic influences. As the one who sent them to their deaths, you were seen as particularly vulnerable to their spectral vengeance, or to the attentions of malevolent supernatural entities drawn to such sites. Nights could be long and filled with uneasy thoughts, especially if your dwelling was, as often, uncomfortably close to your place of work. Sleeping with one eye open for disgruntled ghosts probably wasn't in the job description, but it was an unspoken perk. Historians still argue about the executioner's own religious beliefs and how they reconcile their faith with their profession. Did they see themselves as instruments of God's justice, as some theologians argued secular authorities were? Or did they internalize the societal condemnation and live in constant fear for their immortal souls? Franz Schmidt, the 16th century German executioner, whose diary provides invaluable insight, was a devout Lutheran who clearly wrestled with the spiritual implications of his work, taking solace in his faith and believing he was performing a necessary, divinely ordained, if unpleasant, duty. However, he was perhaps an exception in his literacy and articulateness. Here's a quirky and rather telling tidbit. In some regions, it was believed that if an executioner died without a successor already in place, his spirit would not rest. His ghost would be doomed to haunt the place of execution, perhaps even being forced to carry out spectral punishments until a new executioner took up the mantle. This superstition conveniently put pressure on an executioner's son to take over the family business, not just for societal reasons, but for the sake of his father's eternal peace. Take the job, son, or Dad will be rattling chains at the gallows for eternity. Talk about a guilt trip. Signs of divine disapproval were sought everywhere. If a storm broke out during an execution, it might be interpreted as God's wrath. If the condemned met their end with extraordinary courage or piety, some might see it as a sign of their innocence and, by extension, a mark against you for executing an innocent person, even if you were just following orders. Your every action and every reaction to it was scrutinized through a lens of religious fear and superstition. Even seemingly mundane occurrences could be twisted into omens. If you tripped on the way to the scaffold, it wasn't just clumsiness, it was a sign. If your hand trembled, it wasn't nerves, it was divine reluctance working through you. You lived in a world where the supernatural was deeply interwoven with the everyday, and your profession placed you squarely at the uncomfortable intersection of the sacred and the profane, constantly under a cloud of perceived divine disapproval, a walking embodiment of society's deepest fears about sin, death, and judgment. You exist in a bewildering paradox. You are utterly indispensable to the functioning of medieval society, yet you are simultaneously one of its most reviled members. The law, the very framework that holds the community together, relies on you for its ultimate enforcement. Without the threat of punishment, and without someone to carry out that punishment, the decrees of lords and kings would be mere suggestions. You are the grim foundation stone upon which public order is built, the final, terrifying punctuation mark at the end of every legal sentence. Think about it. Every time a magistrate sentences a criminal to death, or to a painful corporal punishment, they are relying on you. Every time a noble wants to make an example of a rebellious peasant or a treacherous rival, you are the one who makes that example brutally, visibly real. You are the instrument of their power, the physical manifestation of the state's authority to punish. Without you, the entire system of justice, as it was then conceived, would crumble. This is a straightforward historical fact. The executioner was a vital cog in the machinery of medieval governance. Their role, however unpleasant, was deemed essential for maintaining social order and deterring crime through fear. Yet despite this undeniable importance, you are treated like filth. The same society that depends on your services for its safety and stability recoils from you in disgust. The lord whose sentence you carry out would not invite you to dine at his table. The merchant whose goods are protected from thieves by the fear your office inspires would not willingly shake your hand. The peasants who witness your grim work and are thereby, theoretically, deterred from wrongdoing would cross themselves and hurry away if they met you on a path. It's a classic case of don't shoot the messenger, except you're not just the messenger. You're the one delivering the very unpleasant, very final package. This hypocrisy is the central, soul-crushing reality of your life. You do their dirty work, the tasks that no one else is willing or able to perform, and for this, you're branded as unclean, unholy, and unwelcome. It's as if society projects all its anxieties about death, violence, and its own capacity for brutality onto your solitary figure. You become the scapegoat for the harshness of the law. They need the law, they need its enforcement, but they despise the enforcer. It's a bit like complaining about the smell of the abattoir while demanding a steady supply of fresh meat. The authorities, the magistrates, the nobles, the clergy who implicitly or explicitly sanction your work, are usually careful to maintain their distance, at least publicly. They issue the orders from on high, but you are the one with blood on your hands, literally. You absorb the taint, the moral contamination that comes with the act of killing or maiming, allowing them to remain notionally clean. You are their sin-eater, their necessary monster. Consider the psychological burden of this. You know you are performing a service mandated by the highest authorities, a service deemed vital for the common good. Yet, every social interaction reinforces the message that you are somehow personally vile for doing it. How do you reconcile these conflicting realities? Do you develop a cynical view of society, seeing its hypocrisy laid bare? Do you cling to the idea that you are serving a higher purpose, a grim but necessary duty, despite the lack of recognition or gratitude? Historians still argue whether executioners managed to cultivate a sense of professional pride or dignity amidst the universal condemnation. While direct evidence of their inner thoughts is scarce, Franz Schmidt's diary being a rare exception, the meticulous care some took with their tools, or the stoic, almost ritualistic way they performed their duties, might suggest an attempt to find meaning or maintain self-respect in an youth. A wise demeaning role, or perhaps it was simply a coping mechanism, a way to emotionally distance oneself from the horror of the work. Here's a quirky, somewhat ironic tidbit. Because of your pariah status, you were sometimes seen as being outside the normal social obligations and therefore paradoxically more trustworthy in certain specific unsavoury contexts. For instance, if a secret, politically sensitive execution needed to be carried out with discretion, who better than the man already accustomed to grim tasks and social isolation, who had little to lose in terms of reputation? Your very marginalisation could occasionally make you useful in ways that went beyond public spectacle. You were already beyond the pale, so what was one more dark deed to your name? This essential yet reviled status meant you were trapped. You couldn't easily leave the profession, as we've discussed, because the stigma would follow you, and society, for all its disgust, couldn't afford to let you go, not unless they had a replacement lined up. You were caught in a web of their making, a necessary fixture in their social landscape, like the gallows itself, something everyone wished wasn't there, but which served a vital, if terrifying, purpose. The feeling of being used, of being a pawn in a larger game where you bear the heaviest social cost, must have been profound. You see the fear in people's eyes, but also the grudging acknowledgement that your role, however dreadful, keeps the wolves, the murderers, the violent thieves, the rebels, at bay. You're the darkness that allows them to believe in the light, the monster that keeps other monsters in check. This constant awareness of being both critical to society and utterly rejected by it would be a heavy, lonely burden to carry through your days. You are the community's shadow, performing the tasks they need but cannot stomach, forever walking a tightrope between necessity and revulsion. While the core function of an executioner, to dispatch the condemned and administer corporal punishments, was a grim constant across medieval Europe, the specifics of your role, your status, and even the methods you employed could vary significantly depending on which kingdom, principality, or even free city you found yourself in. The medieval world was a patchwork of different legal codes, customs, and social structures, and this diversity was reflected in the life of its executioners. You might be carrying out the king's justice in England, the emperors in the Holy Roman Empire, or the doges in Venice, and each would come with its own nuances. In England, for example, the primary method of execution for serious crimes was hanging. Beheading was generally reserved for those of noble birth convicted of treason, a more honourable death. The English executioner, often just a local sheriff's man or a specially appointed individual for a specific execution, might not have had the same kind of distinct, lifelong professional identity as his counterparts in some continental European cities. The role could be more ad hoc, though the stigma was still very much present. Think of it as less of a dedicated career path and more of a deeply unpleasant temporary assignment, though some individuals did become known for the role. Across the Channel in France, the executioner, the bourreau, was a more established and often hereditary office, particularly in larger cities like Paris. French executioners were known for their use of the sword for beheadings, which required considerable skill. They also had a wide range of other duties, including branding and the use of the breaking wheel. The Sanson family, who became the hereditary executioners of Paris for generations, is a famous example, though their dynasty began in the later 17th century, inheriting traditions that had medieval roots. Journey into the myriad states of the Holy Roman Empire, that complex tapestry of German-speaking lands, and you'd find the Scharfrichter, sharp judge, or executioner. Here the role was often highly formalised. The Scharfrichter was typically a sworn official of a town or territory, with clearly defined duties and sometimes a surprisingly detailed fee schedule. A historical fact, many German towns employed their own official executioners, and these positions were often passed down from father to son. They used both the sword, for beheadings often seen as a more Germanic method, and the axe, as well as the rope and various instruments of torture and mutilation. The diary of Master Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, who executed 361 people and tortured hundreds more between 1573 and 1617, provides an unparalleled window into the life and mindset of such an official. Even though it falls slightly outside the strictest medieval timeline, his profession was ancient. In parts of Italy, the methods and the executioner's status could also vary. In Venice, with its powerful council of 10, executions were often carried out with a chilling efficiency, sometimes secretly. The manea, a kind of guillotine-like device, is recorded as being used in some Italian states even before the French Revolution made its cousin famous. Beheading and hanging were common. The executioner, the boia, was as reviled here as anywhere else, a figure of fear and dread in the piazzas. Further north, in Scandinavian countries, the legal codes, while harsh, might have had their own local peculiarities. Hanging and beheading were common, but methods could also include older, more pagan-tinged punishments in earlier periods, though these largely faded with Christianization. The executioner, or boedel, faced similar social ostracism. The types of crimes that warranted capital punishment also differed. While treason, murder, and aggravated theft were almost universally capital offences, the emphasis on other crimes could vary. Heresy, for example, might lead you to be burning people at the stake under the watchful eye of ecclesiastical authorities in one region, while in another it might be dealt with differently or with less frequency by secular executioners. Witchcraft accusations, which saw a dramatic and terrifying rise in the late medieval and early modern periods, would also bring a specific kind of grim work, often involving torture to extract confessions and then burning at the stake. You'd need a strong stomach for that, and probably a good supply of firewood. Historians still argue whether the perceived honour of different execution methods, sword versus axe versus rope, was a consistent hierarchy across Europe, or if it was subject to local interpretation and the status of the condemned. Generally, methods that were quicker and involved less bodily mutilation, before death, were considered less shameful, but even this was not a hard and fast rule. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, particularly border areas or territories with overlapping jurisdictions, an executioner might find his services rented out to neighbouring communities that didn't have their own dedicated official. You could be a travelling purveyor of justice, a sort of grim freelance consultant called upon when a nearby town had a particularly difficult or high-profile sentence to carry out. This might offer a slight variation in your routine, but it wouldn't do much for your social life. You'd just be shunned in a wider variety of places. Have axe will travel could be your rather bleak motto. So, while the core misery of your job remained remarkably consistent, the social exclusion, the psychological burden, the grim nature of the work, the exact tools you wielded, the specific laws you enforced, and the title you bore could change as you crossed from one muddy medieval border to another. Your English counterpart might be grumbling about a clumsy hanging, while your German colleague is meticulously sharpening his beheading sword, and your Italian peer is ensuring the manor is in good working order. Different kingdoms, different customs, but the same essential, unenviable role, to be the hand that delivered society's most terrible judgments. You rarely stand entirely alone on that blood-soaked scaffold, or in the chilling confines of the torture chamber. While you are the principal, the one whose name, if people dared speak it, is synonymous with the grim work, the reality of medieval executions and punishments often involved a small, equally marginalised team, your assistants. This wasn't a solo gig, especially when dealing with particularly complex executions, managing crowds, or handling the more physically demanding aspects of torture. These assistants were crucial, if often anonymous, cogs in the machinery of justice. Finding people willing to serve as an executioner's assistant was, as you can imagine, not easy. The same stigma that clung to you would inevitably attach itself to anyone who worked closely with you. Often these assistants were drawn from the same desperate pool as some executioners themselves. Petty criminals offered a commutation of their sentence in exchange for service, individuals with no other skills or prospects, or perhaps even family members, sons learning the trade, or poorer relatives with no other means of support. It's not exactly a career path you'd find advertised at the local medieval job fair under exciting opportunities in law enforcement. Their duties were varied and uniformly unpleasant. They might be responsible for preparing the condemned, perhaps by shaving their neck for a beheading to ensure a cleaner cut, or by pinioning their arms securely. They would help lead the prisoner through the streets to the place of execution, sometimes bearing the jeers and missiles of the crowd, alongside you. On the scaffold they might hold the prisoner steady, or manage the ropes for a hanging. If the execution involved fire, they'd be the ones tending the pyre. Their presence was essential for the smooth, or at least orderly progression of the grim proceedings. In the torture chamber, assistants were indispensable. Operating the rack, hoisting a prisoner for the strappado, or heating the branding irons often required more than one pair of hands. They would be there, in the flickering torchlight, responding to your grim instructions, their face is likely as impassive or as hardened as your own. A historical fact. Records from various European judicial systems, when they detail torture sessions, sometimes mention the presence of the executioner's knaves, or servants, Knecht in German for example, underscoring their official, albeit subordinate role in the process. These assistants shared your social ostracism, though perhaps to a slightly lesser degree if their role was seen as temporary or less directly involved in the act of killing. However, any association with you was a taint. They too would find it hard to integrate into normal society, to find other work, or to be accepted in respectable circles. They were part of your grim entourage, marked by their proximity to death and suffering. Their pay, if they received any directly from the authorities, would be even more meagre than yours. More often, they might receive a small share of your fees or perquisites, a few coins from your blood money, or perhaps a cast-off garment from an executed prisoner. It was a hard life for very little reward, driven by desperation rather than ambition. Think of them as the unpaid interns of the medieval underworld, except the coffee is terrible and the tasks are soul-destroying. Historians still argue about the level of skill or training these assistants possessed. Were they merely brute labour, or did some develop a degree of specialised knowledge, perhaps aspiring to become full executioners themselves one day? Given that the executioner's role was often hereditary, or passed to those with experience, it's likely that long-serving assistants did acquire significant on-the-job training, however grim. An assistant who proved reliable and steady under pressure would be invaluable to you. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, the role of an assistant could be particularly gruesome and specific. For example, after a beheading, an assistant might be tasked with holding up the severed head to the crowd. This was a common practice designed to prove that justice had been done and to further horrify and cow the onlookers. It's a job that requires a strong stomach and a distinct lack of squeamishness, and one that would certainly not enhance your popularity at the village fete. What did you do today, dear? Oh, the usual, held up a head, bit windy. The relationship between you and your assistants would likely be complex. On one hand, they were your subordinates, there to follow your orders. On the other, they were among the very few people in the world who could even begin to understand the pressures and realities of your existence. There might be a rough camaraderie born of shared hardship and societal rejection, a bond forged in the crucible of shared horrific experiences. Or there could be resentment and fear, especially if you were a harsh or demanding master. Their loyalty, or lack thereof, could also be a concern. A disgruntled or unreliable assistant could make your already difficult job even more dangerous. If an execution went badly, an assistant might hesitate to help, or even subtly contribute to the chaos if they bore you ill will. You depended on them, not just for practical help, but sometimes for your own safety, especially when facing an angry crowd. So, while you were the one in the grim spotlight, the face of medieval justice, remember that you were often supported by a shadowy cast of assistants. They shared your dirty work, your social stigma, and your precarious existence, performing the essential but unacknowledged tasks that allowed the wheels of punishment to turn. They were the unsung, or rather, unwhispered about in polite company support staff of the executioner's trade. While beheading, hanging and burning at the stake were the grim mainstays of your professional repertoire, the medieval imagination, when it came to punishment, was unfortunately quite fertile. Your duties could occasionally extend to overseeing or carrying out some truly bizarre and horrifyingly creative ways for people to meet their end, or to suffer exquisitely before doing so. These weren't everyday occurrences, perhaps, but they formed part of the darker tapestry of justice and retribution you were sworn to uphold. Get ready, because things are about to get a little weirder than your average Tuesday on the scaffold. One particularly gruesome method, more common in some parts of continental Europe than England, was poenacule, or punishment of the sack. This ancient Roman punishment, revived in the medieval period for the crime of parricide, killing one's own parent or close relative, involved sewing the condemned into a leather sack, often along with a collection of live animals, typically a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, though the exact menagerie could vary depending on availability and local custom. The sack was then thrown into a river or the sea. The idea was that the animals, trapped and terrified, would attack the condemned person within the sack before they all drowned together. As the executioner, your role would be to procure the sack, the unfortunate animals, and oversee the final watery dispatch. It's a punishment that combines claustrophobia, animal attack, and drowning, a trifecta of terror. Then there was immurement, or being walled up alive. This was sometimes used for nuns or monks who had broken their vows in a particularly scandalous way, or for other serious offenders where a slow, hidden death was deemed appropriate. You might be tasked with constructing the small, tomb-like space within a wall, providing the condemned with their last meagre provisions of food and water, and then sealing them in brick by brick to slowly perish in darkness and isolation. The psychological horror of this punishment is hard to fathom, and your role as the final bricklayer would be chillingly intimate. Boiling alive was another horrifying, though less common, method of execution, reserved for certain specific crimes like counterfeiting, as it mimicked the melting of false coin metals, or poisoning. The condemned would be slowly lowered into a large cauldron of boiling water, oil, or even wine. A historical fact: in England, the Act for Poisoning of 1531 specifically prescribed boiling alive as the punishment for poisoning, though it was repealed about a decade later. As the executioner, you'd be responsible for maintaining the fire, operating whatever hoist was used, and enduring the screams and the appalling stench. It's a method that maximised agony and public spectacle in a particularly gruesome fashion. Not exactly a quick dip in a hot tub. For certain crimes against property or the state, particularly in some Germanic regions, being buried alive was also a known, if rare, punishment. This was sometimes seen as a shameful death, the earth itself rejecting the criminal. You would oversee the digging of the grave and the placement of the condemned within it, who might be bound or placed in a coffin-like box before being covered with earth. The thought of the crushing weight and slow suffocation is enough to induce nightmares. And what about punishments that were more about prolonged suffering and humiliation than immediate death? Consider the Lasterstein or shame stones, found in some German-speaking areas. These were heavy stones, often carved into grotesque faces or with inscriptions detailing a particular vice, like gossiping or quarrelling, which offenders were forced to wear around their necks while being paraded through town. While you might not be lifting the stone onto them, you might be involved in the parade or ensuring the punishment was carried out. It's public shaming taken to a very literal, very heavy level. Historians still argue about the prevalence and exact procedures for some of these more outlandish punishments, as they often appear in chronicles or legal codes but with less frequent detailed accounts of their actual application compared to more standard methods. Were they always carried out to the letter, or were they sometimes symbolic threats, with a less horrific reality? The evidence varies, but their very existence in legal texts and popular imagination speaks to a different sensibility regarding pain and retribution. Here's a quirky and frankly stomach-turning tidbit. For crimes involving food adulteration or selling rotten goods, some medieval towns had punishments like forcing the offending baker to eat his own fly-blown bread, or the vintner his own sour wine, often in large, publicly humiliating quantities. While perhaps not directly your job to force-feed, you might be present to ensure order during such a spectacle. Another delightful afternoon out for the townsfolk. It's like a medieval episode of kitchen nightmares, but with much higher stakes and far worse hygiene. You might also encounter punishments designed to be deeply ironic. A poacher might be sentenced to be hunted himself, albeit symbolically, or a perjurer might have their lying tongue pierced. The creativity involved was often as dark as the punishments themselves. Your role was to be the impassive instrument of these varied and often terrifying sentences, adapting your grim skill set as required. From the relatively straightforward, if one can ever call it that, act of a beheading, you might find yourself needing to become a temporary zookeeper for pinocchili, a bricklayer for immurement, or a very, very careful stoker for boiling. It certainly kept the job from being monotonous, though you probably wished for a bit more boredom in your professional life. The human capacity for cruelty, sanctioned by law, seemed to have few bounds, and you were right at the sharp end of it. Given the universal revulsion your profession inspires, the question naturally arises, could an executioner ever, under any circumstances, achieve a measure of respect, however grudging or reluctant? Was it possible to be seen as more than just a feared and despised outcast? The answer is complex, and probably leans more towards no, not really full respect, but there were perhaps shades of something approaching professional regard, or at least a reputation for competence that might elicit a very particular kind of acknowledgement. True respect, in the sense of admiration, social acceptance, or warmth, was almost certainly out of reach. The inherent nature of your work, the dealing of death and pain, the constant association with society's darkest rituals, created too profound a barrier. You were tainted, set apart, and no amount of skill or professionalism could entirely wash away that stain in the eyes of the medieval public. You weren't going to be invited to join the town council or be the guest of honour at the harvest festival, no matter how neatly you could lop off a head. However, within the very narrow confines of your role, you could gain a reputation for proficiency. A skilled executioner, one who dispatched the condemned swiftly and with minimal suffering, relatively speaking, was often preferred by the authorities and, paradoxically, sometimes even by the condemned themselves, if they had any say in the matter, which they usually didn't. A clean, single-blow beheading, or a hanging that resulted in a quick death, rather than prolonged strangulation, was seen as a mark of a good executioner. This wasn't about kindness, it was about efficiency and upholding the grim dignity of the law. It also, crucially, kept the crowd from turning riotous due to a botched job. This kind of professional competence could lead to a certain kind of grim renown. An executioner known for his skill might be sought after by other towns or jurisdictions that lacked a capable local practitioner. His name might be whispered with a mixture of fear and a certain dark awe. Master Albrecht, they might say. He never needs a second swing. This isn't respect in the warm, fuzzy sense, but it is a form of recognition for excelling at a uniquely terrible craft. It's like being the best shark in the ocean. Impressive, but nobody wants to swim with you. A historical fact, some executioners did become well known for their skill and longevity in the role. Franz Schmidt, whom we've mentioned, performed his duties for over 4 decades in Nuremberg and Bamberg, meticulously recording each execution and punishment. While he was undoubtedly feared, his detailed diary suggests a man who took his work seriously, saw it as divinely ordained if unpleasant necessity, and operated with a degree of detached professionalism. He was a known figure, and his continued employment by the city authorities implies they valued his competence. Furthermore, an executioner who was perceived as fair within the brutal confines of the system, who didn't inflict undue suffering beyond what the sentence demanded, and who carried out his duties with a degree of solemnity, might be viewed as marginally better than one who was clumsy, cruel, or seemed to take a sadistic pleasure in his work. The medieval populace, while often baying for blood, also had a sense of just deserts. Unnecessary cruelty, even towards a condemned criminal, could sometimes turn public opinion against the executioner. Historians still argue whether the concept of honour could, in any meaningful way, be associated with the executioner's profession. While the trade itself was dishonourable, unehrlich, was it possible for an individual executioner to conduct himself with a personal sense of honour or duty that might, in some small way, mitigate the stigma? Some executioners, particularly those from long-established hereditary lines, may have seen themselves as upholding a grim family tradition, performing an essential if unloved service to the state with a degree of pride in their unique, if terrible, skills. Here's a quirky tidbit that touches on a strange form of trust. Because the executioner was already an outcast and dealt with matters of life and death, he was sometimes, paradoxically, involved in tasks that required a certain discretion or a detachment from normal societal pressures. For example, if a noble family needed a sensitive task performed that was outside the law but required someone not easily intimidated and already operating on the fringes, an executioner might be a uniquely qualified, if risky, candidate. This isn't respect, but it's a strange reliance on their unique position. So while you wouldn't be winning any popularity contests or expect heartfelt gratitude, a reputation for competence, for a swift and clean execution, could earn you a certain level of grim acknowledgement. The authorities would value your efficiency as it maintained public order during these tense events. The crowd, while still fearing you, might be less inclined to riot if you performed your duties without undue gruesomeness. And perhaps in the quietest, most fearful recesses of their minds, some might even have a sliver of reluctant admiration for the nerve and skill it took to do what you did, day in and day out. It was a far cry from true respect, but in a life defined by universal shunning, even the absence of outright condemnation for your method of work might have felt like a victory of sorts. You were still the monster, but perhaps you could be a competent monster. Your profession, steeped in death and the deliberate dismemberment of human bodies, might seem like the absolute antithesis of healing and medical knowledge. Yet paradoxically, your grim duties could inadvertently provide you with a rudimentary and often surprisingly practical understanding of human anatomy that few in medieval society possessed, apart from actual physicians and surgeons, who themselves often learned from equally grisly sources like battlefield injuries or rare church-sanctioned dissections. Think about it. Every beheading, every amputation, every instance where you had to deal with the physical consequences of judicial punishment was a stark, hands-on lesson in the structure of the human body. You would become intimately familiar with the way bones connect, where major blood vessels lie, and the general layout of muscle and sinew. This wasn't formal, academic learning from textbooks. Those were rare and mostly accessible only to the educated elite. This was visceral, empirical knowledge, gained through repeated, direct, and often brutal experience. You knew, for instance, precisely where to aim an axe on the neck to sever the spinal column efficiently, or how to disarticulate a limb at the joint if that was part of a sentence. It's a dark kind of apprenticeship in applied anatomy. This practical, if gruesome knowledge sometimes led to that strange sideline we touched upon earlier, the executioner as a bone setter or treater of certain injuries. In a society with limited access to skilled medical care, especially for the poor, people might secretly and with considerable trepidation seek out the executioner for help with broken bones, dislocations, or severe sprains. A historical fact, there are records and anecdotal accounts from various parts of Europe suggesting that some executioners were indeed known for their ability to treat skeletal injuries. Their reputation, built on the grim familiarity with how bodies break, paradoxically made them sought after for mending. Imagine someone in a village suffering a bad fracture. The local wise woman might have her poultices and charms, but the executioner, who has perhaps seen or caused countless broken limbs, might have a more pragmatic if rough understanding of how to set the bone correctly. He'd have the physical strength to manipulate the limb and perhaps even some crude splints or bandages acquired through his other activities. It's a desperate choice for the injured party: risk permanent disability or seek help from the most feared man in the community. It's like going to a demolition expert for advice on rebuilding your house. Unconventional, but they certainly know how structures come apart. Furthermore, your involvement in torture, particularly methods that involved stretching or crushing, could provide a grim education in the limits of human endurance and the mechanics of joints and ligaments. While utterly horrific, this experience gave you a unique, if unwelcome, insight into the body's vulnerabilities. Then there was the matter of the bodies themselves after execution. In some instances, particularly if the executed was a notorious criminal, their body might be handed over to medical faculties for public dissection, a rare opportunity for anatomical study in the medieval period. While you weren't the one conducting the dissection, your role in providing the specimen made you an indirect, if unwilling, contributor to medical education. The bodies of executed criminals were a primary source for anatomists for centuries. Historians still argue about the actual extent and efficacy of the executioner's medical practice. Was it genuinely more effective than folk remedies, or was its reputation partly built on the fear and mystique surrounding the executioner himself? It was certainly not licensed medicine, and university-trained physicians would have viewed such practices with disdain and horror, seeing it as charlatanism and a gross overstepping of social boundaries. Here's a quirky and rather macabre tidbit related to this: the so-called Hand of Glory. This was a gruesome charm, believed to be made from the severed hand of a hanged man, often prepared by the executioner or his wife, which, when holding a candle made from the fat of the same unfortunate individual, was thought to render observers motionless, or to open any lock. While more a feature of folklore and criminal underworld superstition, the procurement of the necessary raw material, the hand, would inevitably involve the executioner. This highlights the strange intersection of your duties with folk magic and the belief in the potent, often dark, properties of human remains. Your anatomical byproducts were in demand for more than just medical study. So, while your primary role was to deconstruct, your constant close-quarters engagement with the human body in its most extreme states meant you accumulated a store of practical anatomical knowledge. This wasn't the refined understanding of a Vesalius, but a rough, ready, an often brutally acquired familiarity with the nuts and bolts of human physiology. It was a knowledge born of violence, yet sometimes, paradoxically, sought out for healing. You were a living embodiment of the thin line between butcher and, in a very specific, desperate context, a rudimentary surgeon. This grim, hands-on education in anatomy was another strange paradox of your cursed profession, a sliver of useful knowledge gleaned from a life dedicated to unmaking. Between the public spectacles of execution, the grim sessions in the torture chamber, and the various other unpleasant tasks that filled your professional life, was there any room for a personal life? What did you, the medieval executioner, do when you were off-duty? The concept of leisure time as we know it was a luxury for most in the medieval period, and for an outcast like you, the options were even more severely curtailed. Your personal life, if it could be called that, was likely as circumscribed and isolated as your public one. If you were married, perhaps to the daughter of another executioner or a similarly marginalised woman, your home life might offer some small solace from the hostility of the outside world. Within your own four walls you could perhaps drop the stoic mask you wore in public. Your family would be one of the few places where you might experience something approaching normalcy, though even this would be shadowed by the nature of your work and the social exclusion it brought upon them all. Simple domestic routines, a shared meal, mending clothes, perhaps tending a small isolated garden, whose produce others might shun, remember, would form the quiet backdrop to your grim profession. Hobbies or pastimes would be solitary affairs. You weren't going to be invited to join the village archery contest or the local drinking guild. Perhaps you might find some distraction in carving wood, fishing in a secluded spot, if you weren't chased away, or mending your own tools, though polishing your axe might not count as a relaxing hobby for most. Reading, for the vast majority of medieval executioners, would be out of the question, as literacy was rare, observed from a distance. The local alehouse, a central hub of social life for many medieval commoners, was a place fraught with tension for you. As we've discussed, if you dared enter, a space would clear around you. You'd drink alone, acutely aware of the stares and whispers. It wouldn't be a place for camaraderie or relaxation, but rather another reminder of your prior status. Perhaps you'd prefer to brew your own rough ale at home, if you had the means, just to avoid the discomfort. It's the ultimate social distancing enforced by fear and disgust. What about friendships? True friends, those who offer companionship and support without judgment, would be exceedingly rare. You might find a guarded camaraderie with others on the absolute fringes of society, the gravedigger, the knacker, perhaps a beggar or a wandering minstrel who understood what it meant to be outside the bounds of respectability. These would be relationships built on shared marginalisation rather than common interests, a grim fellowship of outcasts. A historical fact. Social networks in the medieval period were crucial for survival and advancement, and the executioner's exclusion from these networks was a significant aspect of his hardship. Could you attend festivals or market days as a simple spectator? Perhaps, but always from the periphery. You might watch the dancing, listen to the music, observe the revelry, but you would be an outsider looking in, never a participant. Your presence might even cast a pall over the festivities if you got too close. A walking, talking skeleton at the feast. The joy of others would only serve to highlight your own isolation. Historians still argue about the degree to which executioners were able to compartmentalise their lives. Could they truly switch off from the horrors of their work when they returned home, or did the trauma and stigma bleed into every aspect of their existence? Given the all-encompassing nature of medieval society and the public performance of their duties, true separation seems unlikely. The man who tortured another human being in the morning could hardly be expected to be a cheerful, carefree husband and father in the evening, without immense psychological strain. Here's a quirky and rather bleak consideration. What did you do for fun if your very presence spoiled everyone else's? Perhaps some executioners developed a very dark sense of humour as a coping mechanism, though it would be one they could likely only share with their assistants, if at all. Or maybe they found solace in simple solitary pleasures that required no interaction with the hostile world. The warmth of a fire, the taste of bread, even if bought with tainted money, the silence of the early morning before the town awoke to its judgments. Your off-duty hours, then, were not a respite into a vibrant personal life. They were more likely characterised by continued isolation, quiet domesticity within a very small circle, if you had a family, and the constant gnawing awareness of your outcast status. There were no team sports, no community gatherings you could comfortably join, no easy friendships. Your leisure was defined by the same social boundaries that constrained your work. It was a life lived in the shadows, both professionally and personally, a quiet, lonely existence punctuated by moments of intense, public horror. The silence of your home might be a welcome change from the noise of the crowd, but it would also be the silence of profound, inescapable solitude. For centuries, your grim theatre of public execution, the scaffold dramas played out before hushed or jeering crowds, was a cornerstone of medieval and early modern justice. The spectacle was the point. But as the centuries wore on, particularly as the Enlightenment began to dawn in the 18th century, and sensibilities slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to shift, the appetite for these public displays of brutality began to wane, albeit unevenly and over a very long period. You, or rather your successors in the trade, would witness the crowds begin to thin, the nature of your work starting a slow retreat from the town square into more hidden spaces. This wasn't a sudden revolution in penal theory, but a gradual evolution. Philosophers and reformers like Cesare Beccaria, in his influential 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments, began to argue against the excessive cruelty of torture and capital punishment, advocating for penalties that were more rational, proportionate, and aimed at deterrence rather than pure, brutal retribution. These ideas, radical at the time, slowly began to percolate through European legal systems and public consciousness. The notion that public executions might actually brutalize society rather than edify it started to gain traction among some intellectuals and policymakers. You would notice subtle changes at first. Perhaps the crowds weren't quite as large as they once were for a routine hanging. Maybe the authorities began to schedule executions at less prominent times, like early morning, rather than as a midday spectacle. The festive, almost carnival-like atmosphere that sometimes accompanied executions in earlier periods might start to feel a little more subdued, a little more sombre. The raw, visceral enthusiasm for public suffering, while never entirely extinguished, began to be tinged with a new sense of unease or even distaste, at least among certain segments of the population. A historical fact: the last public execution in England took place in 1868, Michael Barrett for the Fenian bombing in Clerkenwell, and in France it was as late as 1939, Eugen Weidmann, a serial killer. While these dates are far beyond our core medieval focus, they mark the end point of a very long, slow trend away from public spectacle that had its roots in earlier centuries. The shift wasn't just about the act of execution itself, but about who was watching and why. The reasons for this shift were complex. Beyond the influence of Enlightenment thought, there were concerns about public order. Large, emotionally charged crowds at executions could be unpredictable and difficult to control, sometimes leading to riots or disturbances, especially if an execution was botched, as we've discussed. Moving executions behind prison walls offered the authorities more control over the proceedings. There was also a growing sense among the ruling classes that such raw displays of violence were perhaps unseemly, lacking in the decorum and order they wished to project. It's a bit like your rowdy uncle, whose embarrassing antics are tolerated at family gatherings for years, until someone finally decides he needs to be kept away from the impressionable children and the good silverware. For you, the executioner, this gradual change would alter the nature of your work. While the core task remained, the stage was shrinking. Instead of performing before hundreds or thousands, you might find yourself operating within the stark, grey confines of a prison yard, with only a few official witnesses, magistrates, prison officials, perhaps a physician, and a priest. The intense public pressure, the roar of the crowd, the need to perform with theatricality would diminish. This might bring a certain relief from the immediate threat of mob violence, but it also meant your role became even more hidden, more liminal. Historians still argue about the true impact of this transition on the executioner's psyche and social standing. Did becoming a less public figure lessen the stigma, or did it simply make the executioner an even more shadowy, almost mythical figure of dread, operating unseen behind closed doors? The shunning likely continued, but perhaps with less daily overt confrontation. This move towards private executions also coincided in many places with efforts to make the process of execution itself more scientific or humane, a grim paradox. The development of new methods like the guillotine, famously adopted during the French Revolution for its perceived efficiency and equality in death, or the long drop in hanging, designed to break the neck instantly rather than cause slow strangulation, were part of this trend. Your skills would need to adapt. The old brutal artistry of the axe or the variable terror of the noose might give way to a more mechanistic, if still horrifying, procedure. Here's a quirky, perhaps counterintuitive consequence of this shift. As executions became less public, the executioner sometimes became a figure of even greater morbid fascination for the press and the public, who are now denied the direct spectacle. Newspapers in the 19th century, for example, often reported on executions in lurid detail, and the executioner himself could become a minor if infamous celebrity. His name might be known, his methods discussed, even if his face was rarely seen by the general populace. So, you watch as the throngs that once pressed against the barriers, eager for a view of your handiwork, begin to dwindle. The grand theatre of public punishment, which had defined your role for so long, starts to close its curtains, act by slow act. The raw, immediate connection between justice, punishment, and the populace is being severed, or at least obscured. Your work, still essential in the eyes of the law, is retreating into the shadows, becoming a more sterile, bureaucratic, and hidden affair. The echoes of the baying crowd grow fainter, replaced by the silence of the prison wall, a silence that perhaps offers a different, more insidious kind of dread. While most executioners toiled in grim anonymity, their names unrecorded or quickly forgotten, a few, through particular skill, infamy, or the sheer volume of their work, managed to achieve a dark sort of historical notoriety. Their stories, often embellished with legend, offer glimpses into the lives of those who wielded the sword or tightened the noose in the name of the law. Hearing these tales might make your own burdensome anonymity feel like a small blessing, or perhaps a missed opportunity for a very specific kind of fame. One of the earliest named executioners who pops up with some frequency in historical chronicles, though details about his life are often mixed with folklore, is from the much earlier period of the Merovingian Franks. A figure sometimes referred to as Clodio's executioner, around the 5th century, is mentioned in tales surrounding the Frankish king Clodio. While not strictly medieval in the high or late sense, these early figures laid the groundwork for the role. These accounts are often more legendary than factual, but they highlight the ancient lineage of the state-sanctioned taker of life. More concretely, as we move into the later medieval and early modern periods, figures become clearer. We've mentioned Master Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, 1555 to 1634, several times, and for good reason. His meticulously kept journal, detailing over 361 executions and hundreds of instances of torture or corporal punishment over a 44-year career, is an unparalleled historical document. A historical fact. Schmidt's diary not only lists the names of those he punished and their crimes, but also often includes his personal reflections, his religious piety, and his eventual successful petitioning for his family to be restored to honourable status after his retirement. He represents a rare case of an executioner whose inner life and professional conduct are accessible to us, showing a man who saw his work as a necessary, if grim, service to God and the community. He was highly skilled, particularly with the sword, and his longevity in the role speaks to his competence. In England, while many executioners remained nameless local officials, some names did become associated with the office, often becoming bywords for the role itself. Jack Ketch, who served as an executioner for King Charles II, James II, and William III in the late 17th century, became so infamous for his botched executions, notably those of Lord Russell and the Duke of Monmouth, that his name became a generic term for any hangman or executioner, and even for death itself. Dancing with Jack Ketch meant being hanged. He's a prime example of how incompetence could also lead to lasting infamy, a reputation you definitely wouldn't want. France, with its tradition of hereditary executioners, particularly the Sanson family, provides a lineage of notable figures. Charles-Henri Sanson, 1739 to 1806, the royal executioner of France during the reign of King Louis XVI, and later High Executioner of the First French Republic, is perhaps the most famous. He personally executed Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, Danton and Robespierre, among thousands of others during the Reign of Terror, mostly using the newly adopted guillotine. While later than our core medieval period, his family's involvement in the trade stretched back generations, and the public nature and sheer scale of his work during the Revolution seared his name into history. His diaries also provide insight into the psychological toll of the job. Then there were executioners known not just for who they executed, but for their perceived cruelty or, conversely, for some unusual act of mercy or quirk of personality. Tales might circulate about an executioner who always wore a particular flower in his lapel, or one who was known for his terse, grim pronouncements from the scaffold. These details, whether true or apocryphal, help to flesh out the image of these otherwise shadowy figures. Historians still argue about the accuracy of many of the anecdotal tales surrounding famous executioners. Were they genuinely as skilled, or as cruel, or as quirky as the legends suggest? Or did their fearsome profession naturally attract an accretion of myth and exaggeration over time? It's likely a bit of both. The public, both fascinated and repelled by these figures, needed stories to make sense of them. Here's a quirky and somewhat chilling tidbit concerning the tools of famous executioners. Sometimes the axe or sword used by a particularly renowned or notorious headsman would itself become an object of grim fascination, preserved in armories or museums, or even as a dark relic. The sword of Justice of Nuremberg, for instance, used by Franz Schmidt and his predecessors, still exists. To hold such an artifact, knowing the lives it ended, connects one directly and disturbingly to the history of capital punishment and the men who carried it out. It's like owning a celebrity's autograph, if that celebrity's main claim to fame was state-sanctioned killing. These named individuals, however, are exceptions. For every Franz Schmidt or Charles-Henri Sanson, whose life is at least partially documented, there were thousands of anonymous men who performed the same grim duties in towns and villages across Europe. Their names lost to time, their stories untold. They were the faceless enforcers of the law's ultimate sanction. As you stand in your own metaphorical medieval shoes, you might ponder whether you'd prefer the obscurity that shields you from wider infamy, or the kind of dark renown that ensures your name, at least, echoes down the grim corridors of history. Most likely, like the vast majority of your colleagues, your deeds and your name will fade with the bloodstains on the scaffold, remembered only in local whispers, if at all. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and deep violet. Not unlike the colours you've become far too accustomed to in your line of work, the day's grim tasks are done, or perhaps a rare day has passed without the call to the scaffold or the dungeon. You sit perhaps by a meagre fire in your isolated dwelling, the silence of the evening broken only by the sigh of the wind around the eaves, a wind that always seems to carry faint, unsettling whispers. The weight of your office, a burden both physical and spiritual, settles heavily on your shoulders as you reflect on the strange, dark legacy you are a part of. What will be remembered of you, the medieval executioner? In the grand sweep of history, your individual name will likely vanish, absorbed into the collective anonymity of your reviled profession. You are a function, a necessary gear in the brutal machinery of justice, more symbol than man. The fear you inspire, the stories whispered about your deeds, these will form the most tangible part of your legacy in the immediate community. You're the local bogeyman, the ultimate deterrent, the one whose shadow falls over every transgression. It's not the kind of remembrance one might choose, but it is a powerful one nonetheless. The tools of your trade, the axe, the sword, the ropes, these might outlive you, passed down to your successor, perhaps your own son, carrying the grim patina of their history. They are the mute witnesses to countless last breaths, silent testaments to the finality of the law. Remember that peculiar fascination people had with splinters from the scaffold or pieces of the hangman's rope? In a way, these macabre souvenirs are also part of your legacy, tangible fragments of the fear and awe your office commands, dispersed among the populace like dark seeds. The very places you work, the gallows field, the execution dock, the stone foundations of the old town jail, will carry the imprint of your presence long after you're gone. These locations often become sites of dark folklore, haunted grounds where the spirits of the condemned are said to linger. Your spirit too might be imagined by future generations to walk there, a spectral guardian of past punishments. It's a chilling thought, to become a permanent fixture in the local ghost stories, your afterlife as an outcast mirroring your earthly one. A historical fact. The decline of public execution and the eventual abolition of capital punishment in many countries, though this took many centuries beyond the medieval period, represented a profound societal shift in attitudes towards justice, punishment, and the sanctity of life. This long, slow change renders your medieval role increasingly alien to modern sensibilities, a relic of a harsher, more brutal age. Yet the questions your existence raises, about state power, about the nature of justice, about societal hypocrisy, continue to echo. As the fire crackles low and the shadows deepen in your small room, you might ponder the paradox of your life. You were dedicated to ending lives, yet your own life was a kind of living death, a profound social and spiritual isolation. You served the community, yet were rejected by it. You wielded the power of the state, yet were powerless to escape your own grim destiny. Historians still argue whether the medieval executioner was primarily a victim of circumstance, a brutalized functionary in a brutal system, or if some found a perverse agency or even a dark pride in their unique and terrible skills. The truth, as with most human lives, is likely complex and uncomfortable. The world outside your window is settling into the quiet of the night, the sounds of the town, the distant bark of a dog, the late-night revelry from an alehouse you cannot enter, the tolling of the church bell that offers you little comfort, fade into a gentle murmur. The stars emerge, cold and distant, indifferent to the struggles and sorrows of the small human figures below. You are but one of those figures, marked by a fate few would ever choose. Your eyelids grow heavy. The chill of the night seeps into the room, a reminder of the coldness you so often face. Let the weight of the axe, the strain of the ropes, the accusing eyes of the crowd all begin to recede. The memories, sharp and blood-soaked, start to soften at the edges, blurring into the fatigue of a long, hard life. The echoes of the block, the creak of the gallows, the final desperate prayers of the condemned. Let them fade, just for tonight, into the deeper silence that awaits. The wind sighs once more, a long, low exhalation, and then stillness. And as you lie there now in your own comfortable bed, far removed from the harsh stones and cold steel of that medieval world, let the last vestiges of that grim reality begin to dissolve. Feel the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blanket. The anxieties of the executioner, his profound isolation, the terrible weight of his duties, these are but shadows now, stories carried on the night air to help you appreciate the peace of your own surroundings. The world of the scaffold, the dungeon, the averted gaze, and the whispered condemnation, let it all recede, like a tide slowly drawing back from the shore, leaving only the quiet lapping of waves against the sand. There is no judgment here, only the gentle passage of time, leading you towards rest. The figures from that distant, harsher era fade back into the mist of history, their struggles and their sorrows becoming faint echoes, no longer sharp, no longer demanding your immediate attention. You have journeyed with one such figure, felt the chill of his world, and now it is time to return to the warmth, the safety, the quiet of your own peaceful night. Let your breathing deepen, slow and even. Let your muscles release any tension they might hold. There is nothing more to see, nothing more to hear from that place. Only a profound and welcoming calm remains. Sleep now and dream of gentler things.